Welcome to the Compact Podcast. This is Jeff Schulenberger. I'm in for Matthew Schmitz, and I'm joined by Nina Power and Saurabh Amari. Today we will discuss ongoing crisis in the Middle East and some of the fallout in the world of art and letters in the West in response to that, and also the recent economic growth figures out of the U.S. and the broader question of what exactly is going on with the economy. So to start off, Nina, you just published a piece for us called The Fog of Art that explores one particular controversy that emerged in the wake of the Hamas attack on Israel and Israel's subsequent assault on Gaza. So this controversy surrounded the magazine Art Forum and has kind of spilled out into the world of arts and letters more broadly. So perhaps you could, tell us about the events you're responding to there and give us a sense of your thoughts on the subject.
Yeah, sure. So without going into too much sort of terrible detail, there's an initial open letter that was published on the Art Forum website and signed by the editor, who subsequently was removed from position, that was pro-Palestinian, but made a really kind of egregious error in not mentioning Hamas's attack, which, had obviously in a way triggered the letter as of response. It was signed by many prominent people in the art world, including Nan Goldin and Judith Butler is not in the art world, but, prominent theorist. And initially, even figures like Tilda Swinton and others, many of whom later retracted their names after what was a kind of quite serious pushback. And I think a lot of people in the art world tend to be left-wing. They have gotten their way ideologically. They've been in sync with all of the institutions and in fact putting pressure on institutions, which they also do in this letter, to take political stands. And we've seen this in Black Lives Matter. We've seen it, against museums, in the rhetoric of decolonialism, which Jeff has written brilliantly about recently. We see this kind of attempt to politicize every and all art and cultural institution. That's been happening for maybe 10 years or so. And we've also seen the kind of expulsion, ostracization and cancellation, no platforming of people within the art world or theory more broadly, to be excluded on the basis of their apparently abhorrent views, whether these are people who, disagree on the sex and gender question or are not deemed to be sufficiently anti-racist enough or so on and so forth, or, anyone who has like a centrist or conservative position, so there's been a lot of this real, serious cancellation and ostracization. Now we see a serious division for the first time in a long time between the opinions of the priests of the art world, and I think that the art world has become this new religion, or the artists are like the high priest. Someone described them as the elites of a certain middle class. They set the mood and they're what we're supposed to care about. And for the first time in a long time, we've seen a division between the people who are paying for the art world, so the collectors and the gallerists and, people who actually have money, and those who are making art or discussing art. And it's come over Israel-Palestine, and, a lot of the gallerists have started to punish those artists who signed the letter. We had confirmation of that from at least one artist, but other people have been apparently dropped. They've had offers rescinded and so on. So there's a kind of cancellation going on this topic. And I try to suggest that, perhaps in a Christian way or even Girardian way, that this sort of cycle of cancellation, now it's come for a lot of those people who themselves have been involved in cancelling and gatekeeping the art world, that we maybe have an opportunity to step back from these kind of tactics and sort of return to an admission or acknowledgement of pluralistic views, the fact that we don't agree on things politically, the fact that, just because someone has a different view from you doesn't mean you should stop them from being able to make a living, and you certainly shouldn't be allowed to defame them or whatever you want just because you think that they are somehow now evil or excluded from your world. So I think we have a real opportunity here. Unsurprisingly, the conservative response to the intra-left art world cancellation has largely been one of kind of vengeance and a sort of humorous, like, well, live by the sword, die by the sword. You're getting a taste of your own medicine. And I think that is a very tempting position. I mean, I'm literally seeing the exact names of people who cancelled me now, describing the art world as McCarthyite, which is like, at very least sort of painfully ironic to see these kinds of shifts. But hopefully people will realise, that they too would like to have free speech and to be able to make work and so on. But I think, in all seriousness, and I really don't wish to conflate, conniptions in the art world with the horror of war. But I think one thing we should acknowledge is that the open letters and this kind of whole sort of, contretemps is also a kind of symptom of a feeling of inability to know what to do, or a kind of, desperate desire to say something or do something in the face of what is mass violence on both sides, and when we know that today Israel have gone in on the ground, we know that many Palestinians have been killed. It's very difficult to extricate Hamas from Palestinians geographically, even if we want to condemn and attack Hamas, to do so without killing Palestinian civilians is impossible. It's been impossible for a very long time. Israel has suffered terribly at the hands of Hamas too. It seems like it should be obvious that there is behaviour and violence to be condemned on both sides, and at the same time it seems incredibly difficult to do this and to try to support and have solidarity with both Palestinians and Israelis. And I'm not sure, I don't know what's going to happen. The situation is seemingly intractable. At the same time, it's a political situation, and that in that sense there must be a political solution, and that war is not inevitable. It is not endless. Wars end. And I think everybody should be trying to think, how do we work backwards from an image of peace? What would peace look like in the region? How would we get there? Even when it's futile. I mean, none of us are politicians. We don't have any say. I think we need to understand analytically America's role in the Middle East, whether it is through how much money they're giving to Israel or even to Iran or things like this. And I would very much appreciate any comment from my colleagues on that kind of material and economic aspect of the struggle, particularly from the American side. What is America's role exactly? What are they trying to do in funding particular groups or giving support to particular groups within particular countries, even when those groups seem seemingly at odds? It's a very confusing situation.
I want to start by just praising Nina's column precisely for its humaneness, because as she says, there's a Venn diagram of people in the kind of broader art / criticism / theory worlds who are now getting canceled. And some of the stuff Nina reports is genuinely dispiriting and disturbing. Galleries returning art, collectors putting pressure on galleries, circulating blacklists allegedly of artists and others who signed the wrong thing. If you drew a Venn diagram between those people, the victims of this kind of cancel mentality currently, and those who themselves canceled others, or tried to cancel others, like Nina herself and many others, because they strayed from one aspect of progressive orthodoxy, typically, especially on gender issues, then that Venn diagram would have a great deal of overlap. And so, as Nina writes in the piece, it would be tempting and gratifying to kind of laugh and say, haha, now it's, the same disciplinary mechanisms are coming for you and being meted out to you. But she doesn't do that. And she says, there must be a humane way to deal with this. And that is that, people should be able to make statements, but also institutions, we shouldn't create this culture where you're into making contemporary video installations, and yet you are expected to have an opinion about whatever happens somewhere else in the world. And that opinion has to kind of be perfectly calibrated to satisfy competing constituencies, between people who are buyers and collectors of art, to gallery owners, to your lefty comrades, etc. People shouldn't have to feel that pressure to begin with. But if they given all of that, I think people should not be punished in this way. It's a very gracious kind of posture from Nina that, unfortunately, I don't think people will come around to, because people are human and they're much more likely to say, well, turnabout is fair play. You did this to us. Now I'm enjoying your downfall. And as Nina says, all of this is, it feels almost wrong to talk about the art world ramifications of this as, in the aftermath of 1,400 Israeli civilians being murdered and hundreds being kidnapped. And on the other side, there's no denying that Palestinian people are paying a heavy price now in a territory where easily half of the population are underage, are under legal age. It's a very young place demographically. And so, many of these cases, you're dealing with people who, they had no choice in the matter of Hamas taking over the small enclave where they were born. And yet there's no denying that they're paying a price. So, in terms of what's happening more broadly, shifting our focus, there's bad things happening. An operation of this kind of trying to dismantle a terrorist group that is so deeply embedded in civilian structures. And this is the kind of cartoon villain aspect of Hamas that, it embeds itself in hospitals and mosques. Makes me think of, and I hate usually, American tendency to have no broader sort of horizon of references than our superhero movies. But the Christopher Nolan Joker, in The Dark Knight has this quality of like doing the most devious thing you can imagine. Which is, by the way, it is a war crime in itself to embed combatants in civilian infrastructure. But at any rate, as horrible as it is, I think it's worth noting as we record this on Tuesday. Now, I may be completely debunked in 24 hours, but so far, there hasn't been a wider regional war, hasn't been a wider regional conflict. This is a great danger. That's what keeps me up at night, is if, Hezbollah at Iranian behest launches a second front to the north of Israel. What would that mean for Lebanon, first of all? Again, because Hezbollah, like Hamas, embeds itself deeply inside Lebanese civilian structures, because a lot of Lebanese don't want to be ruled by Hezbollah. It's just it's an unfortunate fact of the outcome of the Lebanese civil war that all the other armed groups that were involved in the Lebanese civil war were required to disarm, but Hezbollah was allowed to keep its arms so that whenever it wants, it can overthrow democratic outcomes that it doesn't like, as it did in the previous decade. And it can bully the actual nominal government of Hezbollah. So you had the Lebanese government issuing statements where they were saying, well, if war happens, it's out of our control, basically not all, but saying because Hezbollah is the more powerful entity than the government in Lebanon. So what will happen to Lebanese people? Nothing good. And of course, then if Iran becomes directly involved, then we would be in revelation times, as my evangelical friends would say. So what is the Biden administration done? It moved two carrier groups into the Mediterranean. And I think that the point was to signal there that basically to say to the Iranian authorities, look, let Israel do this. No one else is allowed to get into this fight. This is a Hamas-Israel fight. Don't get in. So far, it seems to be working, and it's coming at great price. Domestically, there is a big progressive backlash against the Biden administration. In terms of rhetoric, sometimes it's been more effective than others in batting that away. But and again, it's not easy. But so I guess, you always think, well, how is my government? How is our government doing, all else being equal? And, I think if the goal is, which is a pretty minimal goal, it's not peace, it's to prevent a wider regional war. I think the Biden administration has done good enough. And that's like what I pray for. Nina said, what is your picture of peace? I don't really have a picture of peace when it comes to the Israeli-Palestinian situation right now. It's really, really bad. And of course, the Israeli government of Benjamin Netanyahu has its own very unhealthy tendencies, indulging settler extremists and so on. And what that would all look like after the dust settles is an entirely different set of questions. But what does peace look like for me? For now, it's like, at least it's not an apocalyptic multi-state, multi-non-state actor war.
Just going to go back to the art forum controversy and the sort of fallout in the realm of sort of culture and ideas. I've been trying to think through exactly like why this issue is so weird and distinct in the realm of academia, which I'm more familiar with, and which Nina is familiar with, as well as that of art. And we've mentioned before, one thing that's notable here is that you have a really significant split between donor class and with universities like alumni, and then current students and faculty. And it's hard to overstate how extreme this split is. And part of what's weird about this issue is that on one hand you do have a good amount of pressure that can be brought to bear on institutions from trustees, from donors, and so on, to rein in figures who are seen as excessively critical of Israel. And you can name before all of this, in the past decade or two, you can name a number of prominent professors who have and they're probably the clearest examples of sort of left-wing faculty being canceled, essentially, right? Norman Finkelstein is one example. This guy Steven Saleta is another example. And so these cases they're definitely instances where, far left faculty have been canceled specifically for this reason. So on one hand, that is true. But what's strange about this situation is that you also have an extremity of rhetoric around this issue. I mean, among anti-Israel rhetoric that is quite astonishing sometimes as well. And you saw this in the wake of the Hamas attack. You saw a Yale professor stating settlers aren't civilians. You saw a UC Davis professor literally encouraging people to find the addresses of journalists who were, quote unquote, pro-Zionists and, do whatever to them, and seeming to incite violence against journalists. So I think these are both professors of American studies, interestingly, which, I've always thought is a particularly terrible discipline as far as providing an academic home for a lot of extremely unhinged people who have very little intellectual credibility and are instead these kind of moral grandstanders. But in any case, and there does seem to be a kind of correlation between these disciplines that end in studies, which usually means that it's some kind of relatively novel discipline that was invented in the past 50 years. And the fact that credibility is not staked on any kind of intellectual accomplishment, but on this kind of moral, performance of moral and political superiority. So anyway, what's interesting is that on one hand, you do have a situation where, that there have been cases of people whose speech has been curtailed. But then on the other hand, you actually do have universities providing a kind of safe space for a lot of people who are often saying things that, if you imagined applying them to any other country or any other issue, would be, quite a bit more controversial than they seem to be. So the situation seems quite contradictory to me, that, on one hand, you can find a level of rhetoric against Israel that, is basically justifying mass murder and genocide and things like that. And that's something that you can actually get away with in a way that it would be hard to imagine if you were talking about any other group than Israelis. On the other hand, you do have at least some prominent cases where top-down pressures have been brought to bear on institutions and have been used to kind of rein in certain people. So it's a situation where, on one hand, the rhetoric and the speech and the type of speech is actually quite extreme. Again, it's just like hard to imagine a situation in which, a professor at a prominent research university would kind of publicly justify, massacres of civilians, and essentially kind of genocidal acts by saying settlers aren't civilians and things like that. And that wouldn't lead to their immediate dismissal. So it's very contradictory. And, I think this goes into the art world as well, whereas we've seen in recent weeks, there clearly are similar pressures that can be brought to bear. It's also true that some of these letters that were published were quite astonishing documents in terms of what they actually said. It's a very strange issue insofar as it kind of seems to, allow for permissible statements that it's hard to imagine would be permissible in other contexts, in part because Israel can be framed as this kind of exceptional kind of last colonial outpost or something like that. So it can be the target of all of this kind of decolonial rhetoric that I spoke about. But then, on the other hand, there are kind of at least haphazard pressures that can be brought to bear to kind of rein that in, but not in any systematic way. I mean, and that's where I would say the McCarthyite thing is not really true, because in fact, if it were true that there was a kind of systematic culture of suppression of this type of stuff, and as there is for other kinds of statements, people would have been more afraid to make these kind of statements, which they were not. I think there are these groups that, there's something called the Canary Mission, which basically has been tracking anti-Israel rhetoric among academics for a long time, and essentially publishes a kind of list of people who are considered to be deemed anti-Semites. You can see a similar things for something Nina's written about plenty, right? The sort of trans issue where these LGBT organizations will publish lists of people who are deemed to be whatever pro-trans genocide. The pro-Israel side has used similar tactics, and that's been going on for a while. Overall, I don't think it's actually been that effective, and that for the most part, these people have usually been protected with a few exceptions. And, in a way, the proof of that is that there wasn't really if there had been this McCarthyite environment, then people would not have said the things that they did, like settlers aren't civilians, like, hey, why don't you look up the addresses of journalists and harass their families if their reporting is too favorable to Israel. I just don't know. I think there's been an attempt to do this kind of thing that's been done for other issues on the pro-Israel side, but overall it hasn't worked in any systematic way. And the result is that the whole culture is kind of all over the place as I see it, where you have these pressures, and then on the other hand, you do have kind of unhinged and very extreme statements coming out of these realms.
Very quickly, a reckoning for me was in 2021 when the latest round of Abraham Accords deals were struck, meaning normalization deals between, you remember Morocco, Bahrain, United Arab Emirates, and the Israeli government, Sudan, actually, when the Israeli government. I wrote a piece for the New York Post at the time saying basically a certain kind of progressive anti-Israelism, obsessive anti-Israelism, anti-Zionism was over. This portended the end of that kind of politics, Nina brought up Tilda Swinton. She's obsessed. There's one country in the world that Tilda Swinton would like to see delegitimized and destroyed, frankly, and that's the Jewish state. So it's it is very obsessive. And I do think all anti-Zionism is anti-Semitic, but very often, more often than not, there's an overlap. If you think of all the countries in the world, all of them born in blood, very often border drawing, just in the way that nation states are, it involves population transfers and so on. If you're willing to say, I oppose all nation states, including Israel, that's one thing. And I think it's an unrealistic but unproblematic position to take. But if you say, I accept that the world is divided into nation states, but there's only one, and only that one, which happens to be the Jewish state, which is illegitimate by dint of the fact that it was, like other modern nation states, born as a result of population transfers and armed conflict, then I think that's anti-Semitic. So my thought was that, the Abraham Accords in 2021 spelled the end of this kind of politics. Why? Because if Arab states left and right are making deals with the Israelis, have accepted it. If you go to supermarkets in places like Dubai or Abu Dhabi, you'll see specifically Israeli produce stands, Israeli oranges, and there'll be an Israeli flag, with the Star of David. It'll be this is the Israel section. They even tout it as a kind of sign of how far they've come in terms of accepting a Jewish national presence in the region. And that's, by the way, that's a good thing. So I thought if Arabs are taking this position, then students at UPenn being worked up about the sort of the boycott, divest, and sanction movement looks silly, like the rest of the region has come along so far. I think, obviously I overstated that, I have to admit, and I always try to reassess in light of new facts, and I think it was clearly in this combination of progressive politics, the kind of so-called decolonial attitudes that Jeff has written about in Compact's pages and so on, there still lurked tremendous anti-Israel energy, which exploded the minute this happened. And by the way, it exploded before Israel had responded. And that's the part that should be really discomforting to these people. In that Saturday afternoon or Sunday, I think it was Sunday at Times Square, Israel had not made a single, beyond just fighting back the terrorists who had been, beheading people and kidnapping people. Beyond that, Israel had not made a single armed response, directly involving Gaza itself. And yet you had that crowd at Times Square and elsewhere cheering, what Hamas had done, or at least apologizing for it before an Israeli response even took place. So that was wrong. This is one of those cases where I have to look back on a column and be like, yeah, I thought that the BDS stuff would just, and it didn't. I think partly, now to criticize the Israelis a bit, partly because the Israelis themselves thought we'll make deals with all the other Arabs and everyone will forget about the Palestinian question, because look, they're all worried about Iran. Israel, they view as a bulwark against Iran. No, frankly, everyone's kind of fed up of all the Arab states are fed up with the Palestinians, and no one would like more to forget about the problem than a lot of these Arab rulers. But the problem clearly continued to fester, and it generates energy for really nasty progressive politics in the West as well. So last thing on notes of correction, last week I mentioned a Quranic verse, cited by Hamas in its charter, about killing the Jews, and a sharp listener wrote us and rightly noted that is not, in fact, a quotation from the Quran, but rather it is a hadith, which are the sayings of the Prophet Muhammad related by his followers. And so, correction, I mean, that's not a Quranic verse. And just to read it, though, because it is kind of amusing. The hadith goes, the last hour would not come unless the Muslims will fight against the Jews, and the Muslims would kill them until the Jews would hide themselves behind a stone or a tree, and a stone or a tree would say, O Muslim, O servant of Allah, there is a Jew hiding behind me. Come and kill him. But the Qarqad tree would not say this, for it is the tree of the Jews. So, apologies, correction. Thank you for your corrections. If you hear stuff on our podcast where we go wrong, let us know. We'll always, take seriously our duty to the facts. It was a hadith and not a Quranic verse.
So, moving to the domestic front, recent economic figures perhaps surprisingly showed a 5% growth rate in the American economy, surprising in various ways. This is sort of China-level growth. We were often told, this kind of thing was over altogether. We'd never see it again. And not only that, but we've been in exceptional circumstances. Interest rates are very high. We've been in this process of kind of reconfiguring supply chains, attempting to reshore industry. These sort of government subsidies that came out of the CHIPS Act and the Inflation Reduction Act that, were denounced by Republicans as, job killing and all these sorts of things. And, there's been quite a bit of expectation of a recession, particularly because of these high interest rates. These growth numbers were quite surprising. And I was curious what Sohrab thought the takeaway of all this might be.
Yeah, I mean, it's always risky to opine on the basis of a single quarter's GDP results. Nevertheless, 4.9%, nearly 5%, is really an astonishing figure. I mean, I remember as recently as 7, 6, 8 years ago, the kind of usual suspects, the typical kind of neoliberals and market fundamentalists of various stripes. It could sound like they believe that we are in an age of what they call secular stagnation. And so we should just get used to no growth, or 1%, 2% would be a good quarter GDP growth year on year. And now you have 5%, which, as you said, those are the kinds of numbers that we've come to expect from the developing world. Vietnam posts those kinds of figures, or Turkey, at the height of its Erdoganian rise as a middle economy. And then it's very surprising, and it's happening against the backdrop of the factors that Jeff mentioned. obviously we've had inflation, we've had an interest rates hikes by the Fed in response to that. And usually, the aim of that is specifically to cool down the economy, because there's, what inflation happens is when there's too much money supply chasing too few goods. So the price of goods is driven up, and the price of money goes down. So you raise interest rates, so money becomes more scarce. And the idea is that you cool down the economy. In fact, in some cases, central bankers will say like cutting unemployment is part of that. In other words, they want to create more unemployment as part of cooling down the economy. And so, you have that, but you do have also, you've had tighter labor markets. You've had labor market unrest across regions and across industries. So all of this should point to an economy that is in trouble. And I should add, the neoliberals would say that the kinds of industrial policy undertaken by the Biden administration, wouldn't be efficacious in creating growth. And so given what you would expect from the kind of neoliberal consensus economics, it's remarkable that, we're getting these growth figures. Jeff, I don't know. I'd be curious what you think, but whether or not that'll translate into voters next year rewarding the Biden administration, I don't know, because there's also a great deal of discontent about the economy, notwithstanding the growth. Notwithstanding, by the way, unemployment is at 3.8%. It continues to be historically low. Obviously, that doesn't take into account historically low rates of labor force participation, which is not a problem of the Biden administration per se, but an ongoing crisis across administrations of both parties. But unemployment itself is quite low. Growth is at 5%. On paper, the kind of economic fundamentals that you look to, whether an incumbent administration is rewarded at the ballot box, everything looks good. And yet, I think a lot of people anecdotally, feel bad about the economy. That's partly because there's a housing crisis. We have lots of people who can't afford rent or can't buy, partly because of high interest rates, partly because of other structural factors in the housing market, not least like private equity buying up a lot of the entry level housing supply. So anyway, I don't know. I don't have an answer. I don't think necessarily the 5% GDP numbers will drive the individual marginal voter in a swing state to be like, oh yeah, 5%. That means I'm feeling good too. I'm going to reward Biden. They may not. And so I don't know. I don't have a prediction on that.
Yeah, it all seems very strange and doesn't seem to be going according to much of anyone's plan. Certainly in some ways it would seem the Bidenomics is being vindicated over and against the criticisms from the right. This is quite remarkable, right? That, basically we've been told for a long time that the way to, sort of supercharge growth was just to reduce taxes, reduce regulation, and, open up trade and all these nostrums, which, in fact, on average tended to produce the opposite effect. This does seem to be challenged to most economists' expectations. And another point would just be that, the way the Biden camp is perhaps being thwarted is that it doesn't seem to be, despite the numbers looking good, it doesn't seem to be reaping political benefits from this, in terms of Biden's approval rating. That does seem to have to do with inflation and, high housing costs. So, it doesn't seem to be going according to much of anyone's plan, so it kind of reinforces this weird notion of the economy as just this kind of fickle deity that kind of proceeds according to its own logic, that, an economists are these sort of soothsayers trying to divine what's really going on. And so, yeah, it's a strange moment. Would not want to offer any predictions myself, just because everyone's seemed to have been wrong over the past couple of years. Nina, any closing remarks on perhaps how things look over there? I don't know. My sense is things are worse economically in the UK, but
exactly.
Sure.
I was just trying to think of a kind of point of comparison or so on. Often I'm always looking in America from outside, but yes, in Britain, at the moment, just an overview, I guess, of what's happening here. We currently have this sort of ridiculous inquiry into the COVID lockdowns, which is going on, which I don't know if you've seen the thick of it or In the Loop or any of these very comedic shows about British politics, but it is very much like real life. So you have Dominic Cummings, who's this incredible guy who's actually a fantastic writer and a very funny person, but he's very much like this advisor who swears all the time. So we have this court case inquiry where lawyers are reading out his very, very obscene WhatsApp messages. So this is the sort of current preoccupation of Britain, is with how much politicians and advisors are swearing. I think in terms of the economy, I don't know. We're looking probably at the Labour government coming in. It'll be much of the same. I mean, in terms of how things are governed through the city, it doesn't really matter if it's Tories or Labour. Labour might make some noises about sort of various social initiatives and then not do any of them. We have a very low wage economy. We have very high immigration. I think the government has completely lost track, in fact, of who is here, or where they're coming from. So we have no numbers on that, but we have a lot of people who are making very little money, and the welfare state is sort of, being eroded, and everything's still being privatised. And I wouldn't say it looks particularly rosy. We certainly haven't had these sort of figures of these growth figures, for example. I don't know if we're still recovering from the lockdowns or what have you, but it's very grey, like our clouds.
Your comments reminded me of this line from the cult film With Nail and I, where one character, it says, describing Britain, says, "Shat on by Tories, shoveled up by Labour." So I suppose that's you're currently being shat on by Tories, and then we'll be shoveled up by Labour.
We're in an interim phase. We can be sort of like mildly eroded by both.
All right. With that, we will call it a day. Thank you for listening. And please, if you have not, go to compactmag.com/subscribe. Subscribe for $9 a month, $90 a year to support the work we're doing on the podcast and the magazine. Read Nina's piece on the fog of art. And finally, if you like what you're hearing, please rate and review us on your favorite podcast platform. Thanks, and until next time.